On this week's episode, I'm going to talk with you about how to interview in a loud environment, and I will give you this week's job leads. It's the week of February 24th through the 28th, and this is the QC Step Podcast. Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the QC Step Podcast. I'm Corey Finneran. You can listen to the audio version of this podcast on our website, qcstep.com, or you can download it in iTunes or Stitcher, and those are both free downloads. The podcast is also available in video on our website and on YouTube, and it's closed captioned thanks to YouTube services. You can connect with QC Step through your social networking, qcstep.com/Facebook, and we're at QC Step on Twitter and Instagram. And earlier in the week, I posted an article on our Facebook and our Twitter about information on how to file your taxes with a part-time job. Well, this week, I wanted to talk with you about a situation that you may face in an interview. And I've talked before on the podcast about being mentally prepared for an interview and the different scenarios that you may walk into. And I talked about this on episode number 48 of the podcast, which was 5 tips for standing out in a group interview. And in that discussion, I said that you may not realize that you're walking into a group interview situation. So you need to prepare yourself for the different types of interview scenarios. And one of these situations that you may walk into is a loud environment. Last year, on one of the very first episodes of the podcast that I did, I interviewed a hiring manager from McDonald's. And she said that she conducts interviews in the dining area of the restaurant. Ideally, restaurants or interviews would take place in a nice and quiet area, but not all businesses have nice and quiet areas. So whether it's interview in a dining area of a restaurant or maybe a loud industrial setting in a warehouse, when you're trying to get a job, you need to be prepared for these situations. So here are 3 tips for interviewing in a loud environment. Number 1, ignore distractions. Not only will there be audible distractions with all the noise, but there will most likely be visual distractions too. And I understand that ignoring distractions can be a very difficult thing to do. Myself, I'm easily distractible, but this is a very important conversation that you will be having with the employer. And if you're unable to ignore distractions in the interview, they will probably think that you'd have a hard time ignoring distractions on the job. So keep your eyes and your focus on the person interviewing you. The only thing that matters in the room is the conversation that you're having. Number 2, use an appropriate volume when you talk. If you're interviewing in a noisy environment, you will need to speak at a higher volume level so that the interviewer can hear you clearly. If you're soft-spoken, an interviewer might think that you're timid or you're shy, and that might be the way that you would be with their customers. If you speak at an appropriate volume and with an appropriate tone, an interviewer will see that you are confident in yourself and your abilities. And if you are interviewing in a loud environment, it's probably going to be a loud environment to work in. So an employer wants to know that you will be able to communicate with your coworkers when you're on the job. Number 3, make sure that you can hear the interviewer. Most likely, the interviewer will be using an appropriate volume level with you, but if they don't and you're having trouble hearing them, don't be afraid to ask them to repeat a question. Also, move closer to the interviewer if it's possible. If we use the example of interviewing in the dining area of McDonald's, don't sit back in the booth. Sit up a little bit and maybe lean a little bit forward. If you find yourself asking them to repeat themselves a few different times in the conversation, maybe just say, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you. I think that an interviewer would rather you ask them to repeat themselves than to have you try to guess what it was that they're asking or that they're saying. And by doing this, you're showing that you can advocate for yourself. You've identified that you're having trouble hearing them, and you're making sure that you know all of the information before moving on in the interview. As I said, you usually don't know what you're walking into with an interview. There are many types of scenarios that you will want to be mentally prepared for and that you could encounter. And interviewing in a loud environment or a loud setting, that's one of them. If you follow these 3 tips, I think that you will give yourself a better chance of doing well in the interview and a better chance of landing that job. On last week's episode, I shared information on a job fair and a career fair coming up. The Blackhawk College Job Fair is on March 26th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. and the Career Fair for People with Disabilities is at the iWireless Center in Moline. That's on April 7th. And last year I did a series of podcast episodes on preparing for job fairs and career fairs, and I'll probably go over some of those things again this year leading up to these fairs. I post job leads to qcstep.com on Monday mornings, and I also post the links to the online applications for all of the leads that have online applications. So we'll start off with the Hy-Vee food stores. The store in Milan is looking for kitchen busters and restaurant hosts. The Moline store on Avenue of the Cities is looking for courtesy clerk, dairy clerk, kitchen clerk, and checker. And the Kmart in Moline is hiring cashiers. The Sports Fans Pizza in Bettendorf is hiring kitchen and wait staff. And Menards in Davenport is hiring, and for that lead, you need to apply in person from Monday to Saturday between the hours of 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. And that's at 6600 Brady Street in Davenport. And we have a few job leads for our graduates. Spencer's in Moline, they're hiring sales associates. Dollar General in Bettendorf is looking for a temporary store clerk. And then also, the Painters Union Hall is accepting applications for union painter and drywall finishers. And these are apprenticeships. And you can apply in person between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., Monday through Friday, before April 12th, 2014. And you must be 18 with a high school diploma or a GED. And they do pre-employment drug screening for these positions. And if you would like help with any of these applications or any other applications, or if you'd like help building a resume or maybe doing practice interviews, you can contact Gary or Carrie through your STEP or your co-op teacher, or you can email me, info@qcstep.com, and I will pass it along to them. Well, that does it for this week's episode, and if you're really paying attention, you'll notice that on this episode, I did not talk about what I told you last week that I would be talking about this week. I will most likely be talking about that topic next week, and a lot of times we go into schools and we talk with you or in your IEP meetings and we hear you say that you're not wanting to work because you'd like to focus on school. Well, I want to tell you that you can do both, work and school, and I will talk about that with you about the advantages of doing both and some tips on how to be successful with it. So my plan is to talk about that on next week's episode. Thank you for listening, watching, and downloading, and I will be back next week with another episode of the QC Step Podcast.